I'm glad we're together. That was amazing. I want to start with a story today, and this comes from author, speaker Donald Miller. Do we have any Donald Miller fans? Okay, a few. I'll tell you a story many of you maybe heard. He tells a story about a day that he spent, or an afternoon he spent with a good friend of his who was going through a tough time. And he was going through a tough time as a dad. He was beginning to fear that he was losing his high school daughter. She was going through some tough times. She'd got involved in a very dark and negative group of friends at school, and she was showing interest in things that she had never shown before that were worrying her parents. And then to make matters worse, she was dating one of those guys, okay? So she's dating one of those guys that you don't want your daughter to date. And so mom and dad are worried, and the friend is telling Donald about it, and Donald asks, he says, well, how are you and your wife handling it? How's this going at home? And he says, well, we're not handling it very well. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of fighting. There's not a lot of listening. There's not a lot of respect. And I feel like we're just driving her away, that there's this wedge between us. And he said, well, what things are you doing to try to keep her tethered? And he said, well, she doesn't want to come to church, but we're making her come to church. Because making a teenager go to church when they don't want to is always a good idea, right? And so Donald kind of just laughed and shook his head and continued listening. And so finally his friend gets done describing this, and he stops and he looks at him with just silence, and he's waiting for a response. He wants some encouragement, maybe some advice. And what Miller said surprised him. He said, your daughter has found a bigger story to live. And his friend thought, what? And Donald went on to describe it. It's a bigger, better story as she thinks. She's now a part of a story that's full of adventure and risk and community and pleasure. And maybe for the first time in her life, she's experiencing what it's like to be desired by a boy. And girls like that. Boys like it when girls like them. And he said, your daughter's found a bigger, better story. The one that you had been given her wasn't big enough anymore. That was getting boring. And they went on to talk a little bit about that. And really, if you were to sum up that story, it was just be nice, be good, don't do the wrong things, be a nice, good Christian girl in high school. Now, she had found a better story. And so Miller went on to give him some advice. He says, why don't you take another approach and show her a better story about herself and give her a bigger story to live than the one that she'd been living? Maybe that would replace this new one. And so the dad that day felt like God spoke to him. So he went away and he began to put some thought into it and some work into trying to come up with this idea of giving his family a bigger story. And so 3 weeks later, he had identified a village in Mexico that had a number of orphans, hundreds of orphans, that didn't have a safe place to live because there was no orphanage. And so he said, this is it. So he comes to the family, and they have a family meeting. His wife is there, his oldest daughter, and the youngest son is there. And he says, all right, guys, let me tell you about this village. It's this beautiful place, but there are a bunch of kids that don't have parents, and they're at risk, and they're vulnerable. And guess what? That's the bad news. But here's the good news. Our family's going to help them, but it's going to cost $20,000. And the mom looked at him like he was crazy, knowing they didn't have that much money. And the dad looked at his kids and his wife, and he said, we're going to either earn it, raise it, or save it, and we're going to, within 2 years, provide this orphanage for these kids in this village in Mexico. His wife looks at him like he's nuts. But his kids, we're told, almost immediately start brainstorming, solving problems. Dad pulls out a whiteboard. He must have been an engineer, okay? He pulls out a whiteboard from under the table. He writes the goal on the top, and they start brainstorming together. That goal was accomplished in a much shorter time than 2 years. But that daughter, the one that him and his wife were worried about, that he had shared with his friend about, guess what had happened within the next 3 weeks of her being welcomed into a bigger story? She had broken up with that boy, and she had left that negative group of friends because she now had something better, bigger, to replace it with. She had found a better story to live, one with sacrifice, self-giving love, one where she was needed, one where she needed other people. This was a story where there was connection and community with her parents, and this sense of communitas. And I don't know if you know what communitas is, but communitas is the type of community that's built when you do something bigger than yourselves together, okay? They had that. She had a sense of purpose and connection with God like she hadn't had before. She found a real and worthy adventure worth throwing herself at. Miller, in the book A Million Miles, describes our desire for a big story this way. He says, and once you live a good story, you get a taste for a kind of meaning in life, and you can't go back to being normal. You can't go back to meaningless scenes stitched together by the forgettable thread of wasted time. The more practice stories I lived, the more I wanted an epic to climb inside of and to see through to the end. That story and that quote is the heart behind this next series that we're going to be doing for the next several weeks called Ready. What we want is we don't want to just be ready for the next thing or a new thing. It's not just about fads, but we want to be ready for God to invite us into a bigger and better story. And this is something, I think that people have always needed this, but especially today in our modern, comfortable society. It's easy when life is comfortable. And isn't Boulder County comfortable for most people? It's one of the most comfortable places, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. Think of that. In the history of the world. But when we think that we're in control and there's not a lot of risk that needs to be taken, guess what happened? Life gets boring. It doesn't seem to be an adventure. But the way the scriptures describe life, especially a life with God, which is what faith is, a life with God, a journey with him, is that it is an adventure that requires risk, and it's dangerous at times, and it pushes us outside of ourselves, and we say yes to things that we would normally say no to because we trust him. And so this series is about learning to say yes to God in the new things that he's putting in front of us. So here's something just to think of and reflect on. And maybe even share it with a friend or your spouse or a life group. But what is your story like right now? How big is your story? Is it full of risk and adventure and faith and self-giving love and purpose and the things that make you come alive? Or has it gotten stale and boring? I mean, one thing we have in common is that we struggle with boring a lot in this culture. And we struggle with being bored and still and stagnant in our faith. And so we're about letting God call us into the next big thing. Because you know what? God has a beautiful plan for all of us. It's unique, but there are certain things that we all have in common that God says, this is the theme, this is the tone of the big, better story that I want you to live. This is how big the story is. Did you know from the very beginning, God placed inside of you to hold his very image and likeness? The greatest thing in the world, the greatest personality, the greatest being in the world said to you, you have my image and likeness, and I want your life to tell a story, and I want your story to be of the greatest thing, of me. That's a big story, right? To show God's image and likeness in the world. Did you know that God made each one of you to have significant impact, have significance in the people's lives that you come in contact with? He's put a hero inside of each one of us. I heard this quote this week. I loved it. It said that God has made us to be a blessing to many and a hero to a few. That's a big story. And heroes are not what you think. It's like my mom and my dad. They're heroes. My wife's parents are heroes. Gene's a hero. These are heroes. That's what it's like to be a hero. But God has put that inside of you. There's a big story to live. Now, in this series, what we're going to do is we're going to pull out the stories in Scripture where this very famous phrase in Hebrew, life, is used. So you might not know it if you didn't grow up in this background, but it's the Hebrew phrase hineni, which means literally, I am here, or here am I. Okay, so someone calls you, you would come up, you would say this phrase, I'm here. But in these stories that we're going to use, it doesn't just show up as people saying to God, I'm here, but it shows up as people saying, I'm here and I'm ready. Okay, it's different just to say, all right, I'm here, I showed up. That's one thing. It's another thing to say, I'm here and I'm ready. I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to move. And so we're going to look at stories like Abraham, who was ready to go to a place that he had never been before. He's probably saying, God, can you describe it to me? What's life going to be like? You're asking me to leave all of these things. And God says, don't worry, I'll show you. That's not very helpful, right? But he says, Hineni. Moses responds with, I'm here, I'm ready. It's basically a big yes to God when God says, stop running from your past. Let me redeem it. See, that's the story inside the Exodus story, is Moses returning to his past. You could think of Isaiah, who said yes to a calling, a high calling to be a servant. There's a number of stories that we're going to show you. Now, today we're going to start with the one I think is the best one to start with. It's not the best of them, but it's the best one to start with. And it's a story of a young boy who steps into the bigger story. He says yes only after God speaks to him. The beginning of moving into something bigger and better with God is always the Lord initiating and speaking to us by our name and saying, I want you to follow me. And so this story is from 1 Samuel chapter 3, and it's the story of a young boy named Samuel who's called by God into something grand, something bigger than himself. That story that leads to excitement and risk and journey. And so here's the setting before we start reading. Israel has been living the big story. I mean, it would be hard to deny that life as you just see it is all there is. They know that God's hand is on them. He's done great things. But things have kind of settled down, you could say, or they've gotten boring and still. The tabernacle, the movable temple of God where God's presence was housed, was in a place called Shiloh. It wasn't yet in Jerusalem, its permanent home. And there, a man named Eli for many years was a great priest. But Eli is there, and he's got this dysfunctional family. And that's just a nice way to describe it. His sons were evil men. And they start wreaking havoc, and they're taking advantage of the situation that they have of being powerful and having a name and having privilege and being wealthy. And they're really distorting the whole reputation of the tabernacle and Eli and what's happening at Shiloh. And so because of that, faith for many people in Israel had gotten quiet and boring. Faith had gotten still. And God speaks. And this is what I want you to see in the story. There is a rejection, at least in terms of someone's calling and a calling of someone new in the story because of something called sin. And so I want you to see that today because sin is a big barrier from moving into this grand thing that God wants to use us for. Letting us be heroes to a few and a blessing to many to show his image. Sin is a barrier to those things. And so you're going to hear some of that in the passage. So 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. It says, the boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, where there were not many visions. So in other words, things had gotten still and boring. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord. So Samuel and Eli are both sleeping in the temple in close proximity to God, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, here I am, Hineni. And he ran to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. But Eli said, I did not call you, go back and lie down. So he went and laid down. Again the Lord called to Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, Hineni, you called me. My son, Eli said, I did not call you, go back and lie down. So he keeps waking up this old man. He's getting annoyed. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. Pick up on this detail. Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not been revealed to him. But a third time the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli said to Samuel, go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, and this is another way of saying I'm here, I'm ready. It's a big yes to God. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. It's yes, I'm listening, and yes, I'm ready to obey. So Samuel went and laid down in that place. The Lord came, and listen to this. This is different than the first three times. This is the fourth time now. The Lord came and stood there, moved towards him, calling as the other time, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. Now, this isn't the beginning of Samuel's life, but this is the beginning of a new chapter in this big story that God was giving him. And so this is what we're going to do. I'm going to stay in this story this week and next week. We're going to go through some details this week on things that allow us to say yes to God and things that keep us from saying yes. Next week, we're going to just pull out the theme of distinguishing God's voice, okay? And we're just going to talk about how do we know when God is speaking to us and what does he say. So that's what we're going to do next week. But for this story, things had gotten stale, but God was not done with his people. In those days, we're told that the word of the Lord was rare. Visions were not many. The prophet Eli, who had the privilege of being God's intermediary between God and the people of Israel, but also the people of Israel to God, he had this privileged place. But he was also now in this weird place. Shiloh, which had been a special place of spiritual meaning where lives had been changed, had gotten really weird. People would show up and say, it's just not like it used to be. The awe, the wonder, the direction, the power, it was all rare. It wasn't there anymore. Now, there are different reasons why God gets quiet in life. We know this in Scripture. Sometimes it's his choice. He takes us through a quiet valley to test us. But in this case, that's not what's happening. God is not choosing to be quiet, but God has been silenced. I love Orthodox Jewish rabbi from the last century, Abraham Heschel. And he has a way of saying this. He says, God is not silent, but he has been silenced. See, this has happened here. So what is wrong? What's not right? Well, the question is that there are people living for themselves. They're choosing themselves over God, and they have silenced the voice of God. And what is it that's silencing him? It's this life, this embrace of sin in their life. Now, modern people we don't like talking about sin, but it's something we can't get away from. Every one of us kind of carries this thing with us that we deal with from time to time, and it is our rebellion against God, but it can also show up as our indifference to God and his ways. And sin always hurts us. It always hurts people. It eventually does. And sin in almost every case is about us choosing ourselves other than God or over other people. So God wants us to be self-giving and submissive to him, but when we sin, we choose ourselves over him. Now, here's what's important to understand about sin, and at least the theme here of God calling us into something better. To be called into something big, we must say yes. Sin is saying no to God. Relationally, practically, spiritually, sin is saying no to God. It's saying no to his presence. It's saying no to his care. It's saying no to his power in our lives. It's saying no to his vision of who we're to be. It's saying no to his kingdom, his agenda in the world. It's saying no to all those things. But loving obedience and faith, when it's a response to God, guess what that is? That's the way of saying yes. Not just to God, but to all of those other things, his ways, his direction, when he's speaking to us. Sin is a way of saying no. Faith and obedience is a way of saying yes. And so you have a mess here. Look at chapter 2, verse 12. Eli's sons were given this polite word, scoundrels. They should have been described with a curse word. What they were doing was terrible, and they were hurting people. Chapter 2, verse 17, where we see the sin of the young men was so great in the Lord's sight because of all these things. It was not just a small thing. It was, by the way, everyone sins. And God's not just looking down on them if this one mistake or here. They're living this life. They've completely turned their back on God and his ways. They've said no to him. And they are living a much smaller story. Here's the essence of the smaller story these young men are living. He had 2 sons. Their dad was called to be a priest who, in his line, his sons and their sons and their sons would have this special role of being a priest for the nation of Israel and to minister to God there in the temple and tabernacle. The sons have purpose in their life. They have great meaning. They're born into almost this privilege of being a servant. So it's similar to being born into royalty. They're born into the priesthood. Their whole life from the very beginning was to be a offering, a giving out for God and his people. That's the big story that God was calling them to live, to be a servant in his temple. And what are they doing? They're choosing to use their wealth, their freedom, their name, their privilege for themselves. They're wasting their lives on themselves. And the story has gotten very, very small for them. Self-focused, self-absorbed, selfish. There's no faster way to limit your story than to just live for yourself. They've made it all about them. And they're not the only ones that are having a hard time. We're told that God is upset with Eli. Chapter 2, verse 29. We're told that Eli honors his sons before the Lord. Chapter 3, verse 13, we're told that the Lord says that he will judge Eli for his complicity in what his sons are doing. And some would say, well, that seems pretty harsh. But you know what I think God is judging Eli on? He's judging him on his most important job. Some could say Eli's most important job was to be a prophet, to be a priest, to speak on behalf of God, to minister to the Lord. But that's not his most important job. His most important job, although that's important, his most important job is to be a husband and a father. And he has neglected what comes first. Now, this is kind of a theme for pastors and people who do ministry. They say, hey, I'm doing important work. They sacrifice their family. This is a hazard of the job that I have. But I'll tell you what, I know a lot of people who sacrifice their family on the altar of success and career and upward mobility. They sacrifice their family. And even though your job is important, it's not as important as the job that God has given you if you're a husband or a wife or a parent. And so Eli's neglecting this. I think this is what had taken place over time, and he's now lost his sons. And so the Lord says, I now have to choose another family. Now here's what's important to catch. This is a sad story in some respects for Eli. There's a rejection of him and his family. But here's what you need to see. Most people, if not all, that believe in a God who is loving, most people say, I would like to be connected to that or to him or whatever that is, right? Even if they don't name him by name. Most people want to have some sense of connection with God. And if you begin to hear that he's loving, you want to have a sense of intimacy and care with him. Listen, we cannot live however we want and experience intimacy with God. You can't have it both ways. One of the ways I illustrate this all the time is, there are things in the scriptures called the virtues or the fruits of the Spirit, and these are things that, they're Jesus qualities that we want to live out. And a lot of times we do it because we think this is just what we're supposed to do. But with every virtue comes blessing, okay? And some of that blessing is feeling connected to God and hearing his voice. And here's an example. 9 out of 10 people want to be married or will be married at some point in their life. Almost everyone that's married would like to experience some degree of intimacy and oneness with their spouse, right? You don't marry someone just to say, I hope I hate you. You want to experience oneness and love with them, okay? Listen, without the virtues of fidelity and purity, intimacy is impossible. So fidelity and purity are delivery mechanisms for intimacy, okay? So this idea of connecting with God, hearing his voice, letting him draw us into a bigger story. If there is sin, and I'm just talking about unrepentant sin that's built up in our lives, or we're just being stubborn with certain things, it becomes a barrier. It doesn't make God run away from us. He's always close, but it silences him. And it puts up a wall. When I was in college, I went through a time of growth, and I had someone that was discipling me, and during that time, they kind of teach you the different foundational beliefs of our faith that are really important. So one day we talked about sin. And I can remember, I don't really remember the lesson, but I remember a picture that was a part of the lesson. And it was of 2 people. One was God and one was a person. And the idea is that we're to live in relationship with God, connection, intimacy. Think of it as a long walk with Jesus, okay? But what sin does over time, when we don't confess it, we don't deal with it, we don't repent, we begin to put up a wall between us and a God who is close. And so what happens is that wall creates the illusion that God has left us, that God doesn't care, that he's far away. But that's not really the problem. The problem is that we're stubborn. The problem is that we continue that certain thing over and over again. The problem is that we keep trying to manage the things that are us saying no to God. And it becomes this barrier. I love that image. He's close, but it becomes a barrier. See, this is a part of the story. This is what had happened for this entire family. Hebrews chapter 12 has a passage that a lot of people like to quote. It talks about Jesus, Yeshua, being the author and perfecter of our faith. And that he's the pioneer, that he's plowing the way, that he's the one that's writing the story. But look what it says before that. Surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles us. You know what I think that's saying? Is it should be celebrated in a faith community when people repent. That's the kind of thing that should be honored. Courage to change. Courage to say, I need help. Great cloud of witnesses, throw off everything that entangles, then run the race. Then live the big story that God has given you, whatever it would be. Now, here's what's great about this story, even though it's kind of a tragedy for Eli. And I think he understood it, even the way he responds. God was not done speaking to his people. God wasn't satisfied with stale and boring. And so what does he do? He moves towards a new prophet, a new priest, this young boy named Samuel. We see it here. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. That's not just a literal lamp. It's a reflection of God's grace and his presence. It would never burn out for Israel, and it hasn't yet. In this story, it says it's still burning. I'm still faithful, and I'm going to move towards you. And so now we see this theme of God moving towards his people to move them into this bigger story. Look what's happening here. So imagine you have this temple in Shiloh that's literally the center of the universe in the way at least that God was thinking, because God's the center of the universe. And because God had made his home there, it's the center. It's the center of spirituality. If you want to have an answer about God, it's the best place to go. Eli is a wise prophet that's been serving God for many years, and Samuel gets to live in the temple with him, and he has since the day he was born. His mother actually gave him to the Lord as a servant of God, and that's why he's there living in the temple. So he has this going on. He's in the right place with all the right symbols. He would have the beautiful menorah and the bread. He would have seen it in the temple. He would have known what was in the Holy of Holies. He would have seen the function of the temple. He would have seen the presence of God, yet something was lacking. He had the best teacher, yet something was lacking. He was doing all the right things. He's living as intentional and as committed of a life as anyone ever could to the Lord, yet something is lacking. And what is it? It's God's voice speaking to him. We're told that he didn't recognize the Lord because God's voice hadn't yet come to him yet. So 3 different times the Lord calls out, and he says, Hineni, but it's actually to Eli, here, I'm ready. But then Eli says, hey, I actually want you to go back to your room after the 4th time, and this time when you hear that, it's God speaking. And it's not just God, I'm here, I'm ready, but it's God, I'm here, I'm ready, I'm listening, and I'm ready to obey. Look what's neat about verse 10. So the 4th time, it's different because we're told the Lord came and stood there with Samuel. Now, I don't know if the Lord was there in a physical manifestation or if Samuel just knew that it was God in the room without seeing it. That's what faith does, by the way. It allows us to see what our eyes and our ears can't see or hear. Okay? Faith is another way of knowing. So God lets him see him. He moves towards him to give him the thing that he needed most, which is God speaking his name and calling him into something great. Now, what this means is that you can surround yourself with spiritual things. You can do all the right stuff, but just say, yeah, something's not quite right. Something is boring. You know what's missing? It's the voice of God. That's why this theme is really important to us here at Cornerstone, learning to hear God's voice, either through someone else or prayer or feelings or emotions or events or scripture. God speaks to us. And so even though Eli and Samuel, or I should say Samuel, had everything he needed, he still needed something else, and that was to wait on God to speak to him. So this series, what we're wanting is we're wanting to hear from God about the bigger story that he's calling us into, because I can guarantee none of us are experiencing it 100% the way it could be. And so God is always saying there's something bigger and there's something better. And so we're waiting to hear his voice so we might respond the way Samuel did, which is with a big yes. Whatever it is, God, yes. Now, I knew as we were talking about this that we would have to talk a little bit about what it feels like to trust God. Faith has a feeling, and it's called risk. That's how it feels, okay? Faith doesn't feel good unless you like the feeling of risk. And I thought, well, the best way to talk about that is to illustrate it. And so, you get to hear my stories all the time, and my life's actually been pretty boring. All the times that God has asked me to say yes, I've been able to say yes. I felt like it hasn't been disruptive. I felt like it hasn't been very risky, but that's not the story for everyone, and I want you to get a different perspective. So this is my friend Dan Lance. You guys saw him up here leading earlier. Dan and Alyssa, as much as anyone I know, have said yes to God when it has led to at least a temporary time of disruption and chaos and risk. And I'm inspired by their faith. I'm inspired by the way they say yes over and over and over again, even when it's difficult. And so Dan's going to tell you his story, and we have a big joke, which is he's an old preacher, and I gave him 10 minutes to tell his life story. So good luck, buddy.
I got this. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for letting me share. I think probably the easiest way to describe just how my life has felt is as one large poker game. I don't know if you've ever played poker, but there's strategic moments within the game when you're playing with somebody else and you assess everything that you have on your side. You look at your chips and you're ready. It's like your move. And you risk it all. There's no turning back at this point. You push all your chips to the middle of the table. You say, I'm all in. And at that point, there's no more safety measures. You either win or lose. And I feel like I've run into those moments in my life over and over and over again. And I believe that the Lord is asking for all-in moments, those moments of saying yes, as we're wanting to develop a story that matters, that we would come up to places in our lives where we assess everything that we've been given and push it all to the middle of the table without control, no safety net, and just say, I'm all in. See, this isn't how I grew up, though. I actually grew up in a really extremely stable environment. I'm fourth generation Riverside, California. Don't ever go there. That was my first 30 years. And my dad was a pastor my entire life. He first 10 years of my life, he was a youth pastor, then 10 years as an executive pastor, now 20 years as the senior pastor. I couldn't have grown up in a more stable environment. Amazing parents, and just super, super stable. I went to college up in Redding, California, and I had a significant moment there in college. I just remember for the first time being away from my family, being challenged to actually step out on my own faith that didn't have anything to do with theirs anymore and be able to say yes to God. And I just remember making a promise. I just told the Lord, I said, God, no matter what happens, I don't know what's next, but I'm going to say yes. Whatever you call me to. At that point, I was a rock and roll star. And I just told the Lord, if it means this, I'm going to do this. Whatever it means, I'm going to say yes. That's also a terrifying thing to say, by the way, just in case you're wanting to do that. But because he will call you on that. And it's happened over and over in my life. So I graduated. We got married. My wife's here. She's amazing. And we moved back to Riverside. I started working for my dad. It was an amazing time in our lives, but also extremely hard. It was a giant church with a really large staff. All of our best friends were on staff with us. They were all starting to have kids. All of our friends up in Redding were starting to have kids. It was the biggest desire for us to have kids, and it wasn't happening. And it was extremely challenging in a church that large where everybody knows you, and you're struggling with this, and you're a pastor. And so that went on. My wife and I have always had a giant heart for adoption. She spent time a summer in Ukraine when we were at Simpson, working in an orphanage. I've always had a heart to adopt as well. And we just never thought that was the order, how God was going to work things out to build our family. We started getting into the process of foster care, which is a giant ordeal, if you've never been through that. Then we got a phone call on April 30th, 2003. It's interesting to me that there's moments in life, and it's crazy. It's phone calls. It's a text. It's a moment in God's presence. It's someone with a word at a timely time. But it's amazing how moments can shape the entire rest of your life. But this is one of those for sure. This was the first all-in moment. This is the first time we were challenged with saying yes. We got a phone call that said, there's a woman in the hospital. She's just given birth to a baby boy. He's 3 months premature. He's 2 pounds, 11 ounces. The adoptive couple that was lined up to adopt him has backed out. They got scared of how small he was. Would you like to come and interview to become his parents? If you've never been faced with a phone call like that, it is absolutely terrifying. This was our first kid. We have no idea what we're doing as parents. I just turned to my wife. We talked. We prayed. And that was our first big yes. We knew that God was calling us to be parents. So we went down there, and a really long story short, we sat across from a woman that interviewed us moments after giving birth, which is crazy. And before we left, she said, I choose you guys. And someone put a wristband on my wrist, and I said, did I just become a dad? And the next 2 months, we were in the hospital every day. We brought Zeke home. on an oxygen tank and a heart monitor, and it was an unbelievable experience, extremely, extremely hard. And that started our heart for adoption. We continued to work at the Grove. I was being groomed to take over this enormous church. I know I don't fit the bill, but that was actually what was happening. And during that time, we had a miscarriage, which was extremely devastating for us. Not only did we lose a child, there was also this realization that we actually could have children. Years passed after that, we still couldn't get pregnant again, and God put it on our heart again to adopt. And we adopted our beautiful baby girl, Sophia. She's back there. She turns 10 in a couple days. She was 6 months when we went to go get her from Kyrgyzstan. We were looking into Ukraine. That had been closed down. We wanted a connection to where Alyssa had been. We found this amazing country and adopted Sophia from there. It just continued to grow in our hearts that was our second really big yes. But it comes at a price. I mean, we had no idea how it was going to happen. We had to refinance our house. It was $40,000. In those moments, it started to really press on us how hard it was for people to build a family this way, and it started giving us ideas for how we could help people in the future. But during that whole process, we started to feel really dissatisfied with where we were at our church. That's not always easy when your dad's the boss. And I just remember going to my dad and saying, look, I want to be a good son and not a disgruntled employee. And if you know me at all, I come up with harebrained ideas. I'm like, we got to do something new. We got to change. And so like I was talking to Alyssa, and I just said, hey, how about this? Let's convert our garage into a living space, and let's have some friends move in with us. We'll live in community, and I'll start flipping houses. I went out and bought a truck. It wasn't a good idea. But it was an idea. It started the ball rolling. And it was in that moment that I got a call from my friend that I had graduated college with up in Redding, California. He had started a church that was about a year old. It was planted out of the church that Aaron and I went to in college. Aaron was actually a pastor there at Risen King. This church was called The Stirring. It was doing extremely well. It had just started. It was kind of growing to a place where he said, I got to have help. And it was another phone call. It was one of those moments where I told him no. And as soon as I hung up the phone, I knew in my heart that we were moving. It's like I said, no, we're not leaving. And as soon as I hung it up, I knew that we were going to go. And that just started another conversation with Alyssa, like, fourth generation Riverside, groomed to take over this giant church. We had a nice house. We finally had the family that we had longed for so long for. Everything was set up. It was like what you do to like put it in cruise control and just like take it to the end. And I felt like the Lord was saying, it's time to go. And it was really, really hard. And as we left, literally, I was up there with all of our stuff, and the kids were still, and Alyssa were still in process. I found out that we were pregnant. And it was incredible and devastating because it had been the thing that we had waited so long to happen for Alyssa to be around friends and family. And now we're in a brand new community and learning how to do all of the pregnancy thing. We had never done that on our own. And we had Moses, our miracle baby. And so all of that happened. We started this church, and our whole family put our heart and souls into this place. I mean, as much as you can to a place, we gave ourselves to it. It started off as a night service that was meeting in a basement of a Nazarene church. It moved to like 4 services in 2 different locations that we had to set up and tear down every single time. It led to me overseeing a project for 18 months where we built a large facility that was able to house us all. And at the end of all that, well, actually in the middle of all that, I went on a run that changed my life, and I heard a rooster by a farm, and I don't know, it was wild. I heard a rooster. It was still in the morning, and I felt the Lord stopped me in that place, and he said, Dan, I want you to be like this animal. I want you to get up in the midst of the darkness and announce to the world that it's going to get better, that there's light out there, that carry a message of hope with the rest of your life. Surround yourself with people with the same message, and give your life away to things that matter. We started a nonprofit. We started giving money to adoptions. We started throwing shows with some of my friends. Unbeknownst to me, that nonprofit, through a whole nother long story, led to me being asked to leave the church that we were at in Redding. It was devastating. We had just bought our dream house. It was on top of a hill on 8 acres. We had 360-degree view of Mount Lassen and Mount Shasta. We had split the lot because Alyssa's family had moved from Riverside to live with us. We were going to retire in this place. And in that moment, we were asked to leave. And I knew I couldn't stay in Redding. There was no way I was going to Riverside. And my buddy Aaron took a job. And we just wanted to be around people that we loved. We didn't know what to do, so we moved out here. In the midst of all that, the Casadas, they called and were like, hey, we're ready to move to Redding. And I was like, well, that's a bummer because we're not there anymore. And I said, how do you feel about Colorado? And they said, okay. So we all ended up here trying to figure it out. It was crazy. We were trying to do the nonprofit. It was floundering. Josh and I worked at Lowe's. That was a huge bummer. And the Lord spoke to me again, and he said, what if you created a business? And what if you were able to do a for-profit that just gave money back to a nonprofit? I called a buddy of mine. We started 2 restaurants in the last 2 years in Longmont. We've given $20,000 back to adoption. And I feel like the Lord gave me new passion. I had been a pastor for 13 years. I didn't know anything to do besides that. That was who I was. And I think the Lord reshaped me and said, I got something else for you. God places us these all-in moments in front of us all the time. Sometimes they're huge and sometimes they're small. But that's the question I keep going back to me. Donald Miller messed me up a long time ago because he said, what kind of story are you writing with your life? Would anyone be interested in reading it? I don't know that mine's great, but it's interesting. Saying yes to the Lord with your whole life will ensure that your story is worth reading. It will not protect you from heartache, from disappointment, from getting fired, from being broke, but you'll have a story. I'm just convinced that the Lord doesn't need more superstars. He just needs faithful kids that will just continue to say yes. Just promise that to him. No matter what it takes, no matter what you ask, it's probably going to be terrifying, but I'm all in. No safety nets. If you can take from one person's experience, we're still alive. We're still making it, and it's awesome. If you're not sure where to start, I would just say this. If you don't know what part of your life you want to give that all-in moment to, just start paying attention to the things that make you cry. The areas of your life that make you come alive. The things that make you angry. A lot of times that's where the Lord's starting to push buttons in your life to see what you're going to do. Pay attention to those things. Let's pray. God, more than anything, I want to write a story with my life that makes a difference. Not because of me, but because you're amazing. And you take the things that we're good at. You take the things that we're bad at. You take the things that make us angry and the things that keep us up at night. And you can transform those into beautiful things. God, I just pray for a heavenly provoking where you just keep people up at night. It's a bummer, but it works. And I pray that you would start to give people dreams and hopes for a different future, for what their family and neighborhood and world could look like. God, we say yes to you with no reservations. Would you do what you can only do? We love you, Jesus.